A white man humiliated a black CEO mid-flight, but the CEO still landed the jet flawlessly and secured the contract, leaving everyone in awe. A white man threw boiling tea on a black CEO's face mid-flight, thinking the burn would break his focus. He didn't realize the CEO would still land the jet flawlessly and secure the contract moments later. The second that tea hit his skin, the story flipped. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when true strength rises. The tea splashed across Kendrick Valent's face before he ever saw Garrett's arm fully extend. The scalding liquid struck his left cheek and neck, sharp as a whip of heat, leaving his skin already blooming red. The porcelain cup clattered to the floor as the jet's cabin hushed in stunned disbelief. Kendrick didn't cry out. He didn't stumble or retaliate. Instead, he slowly raised one hand to his cheek, his breath caught between the sting and his resolve not to give Garrett Voss the satisfaction of a reaction. Garrett stood above him, his own hand still outstretched, as if unsure whether to pretend it had been an accident or own it with smirking finality. "Oh," he muttered, feigning surprise, "hope that didn't ruin your pretty pitch deck." His voice slithered with mock concern, but his eyes burned with something more sinister. Resentment, maybe even fear of being outpaced by the man he was trying so hard to diminish. The flight attendant nearest to them, Darnell, a quiet, observant man in his 40s, rushed forward. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked, kneeling instinctively with a towel and grabbing the emergency burn gel from the side cabinet. Kendrick didn't speak. He sat straighter his seat, his tablet still open, droplets of tea steaming on its shatterproof screen. With the same hand that now trembled slightly, he closed the cover, then looked up. His voice, when it finally came, was controlled and low. "Bring me the flight log," he said to Darnell. "And tell the captain I need a word. You're seriously letting him play pilot now?" Garrett scoffed from behind, shaking his head. "You burn your face and suddenly think you own the sky?" Kendrick ignored him. Behind his calm demeanor, his thoughts ran fast and hot. Not from panic, but from calculation. Every second counted now. The cabin was more than just a luxurious shell of comfort. It was a proving ground, and Garrett had just turned it into one. The incident would be seen, remembered, reported, and Kendrick knew that the best response wouldn't be a lawsuit or a fist. It would be control. Mastery, landing the plane, the deal, and the future, all with blistered skin and unshaken poise. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft entered a turbulence patch. A soft chime echoed above them, signaling passengers to fasten seatbelts. Kendrick reached for his without hesitation. Darnell had applied a dab of gel to his cheek, now smeared with sterile gauze. It stung, but not nearly as much as the memory of Garrett's sneer, the way his words had bitten from the moment they boarded. It had begun the moment Kendrick stepped onto the tarmac. Captain Trenton Hale had met him with a firm handshake, eyes level and respectful. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Valen. We're honored to have you on this flight." Kendrick, nodding with quiet appreciation, stepped into the cabin, streamlined leather, oak paneling, and Bravern Forge's understated luxury built into every crevice. He settled into his seat without ceremony, placing his slim briefcase beside him, opening the secure tablet loaded with the final version of the turbine proposal. Garrett had already been seated near the rear, his expression folding slightly when Kendrick walked in. The flight attendant had offered Kendrick a cup of specialty tea typically reserved for Bravern Forge's internal board members. It was a small gesture, but not missed by Garrett. That's when he leaned toward Darnell and muttered, loud enough for others to hear, "Doesn't look like first-class material to me." Kendrick had paused briefly, then lifted the cup and sipped. He hadn't come to win respect through argument. He came to win it through undeniable performance. Respect, he believed, wasn't given, it was proven. And now, as the tea scalded his face and Garrett tried to smother his cruelty under a laugh, Kendrick knew that moment had just arrived. Another bump in the air shook the cabin, and the co-pilot stepped out to assess the situation. Darnell exchanged a look with the cockpit and gave a quick nod to someone inside. "Captain Hale has been informed," he said to Kendrick quietly. Kendrick stood. There was a slight sway in his frame, whether from pain or the shifting altitude, no one could say. But he didn't stumble. He didn't rush. He moved like someone used to turbulence, internal or external. As he walked past Garrett, the man's laughter followed him like a weak echo. "You think they'll sign with you?" Garrett called. "You'll never be the face of aerospace." Kendrick stopped at the threshold of the cockpit. He turned his head, just enough for the burn to catch the light, raw and ugly, yet worn with dignity. His voice, when it came, was ice over fire. "Then maybe they'll trust my hands instead." And he stepped inside, leaving the cabin and Garrett's sneers behind. Respect, he thought, isn't given, it's proven. The porcelain teacup arced through the air with sudden, violent precision. Steam coiled behind it like a tail of smoke before the scalding liquid struck Kendrick Valen full on the left cheek and neck. A sizzle met the gasp of the cabin. The tea splashed down his collarbone and soaked into the fabric of his tailored suit, leaving blistering skin exposed beneath. Time fractured into seconds. Kendrick didn't cry out. He inhaled sharply through his nose, a controlled breath, even as the burn lit nerves beneath his skin. His hand shot up instinctively to shield the damage, fingertips brushing raw heat already rising across his face. The flight cabin froze. The quiet hum of engines filled the silence Garrett Voss had just ripped open. The man himself lowered his arm slowly, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and mock surprise. "Oops," he muttered, too flat to be taken as anything but mockery. "Just lost his composure," he added, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, as if he were offering commentary on a child's tantrum rather than explaining away his own assault. Kendrick didn't speak. He remained seated, one hand clutching the armrest, the other pressing a cloth napkin to the bubbling skin on his cheek. A flight attendant sprinted over, her voice tight with panic. "Sir, are you all right? We need to—" Kendrick raised his hand, not to signal pain, but to pause her. He slowly set the napkin down, inhaled again, and lifted his gaze toward the front of the plane. His vision blurred momentarily, but his purpose was clearer than ever. The scent of scorched fabric mixed with metal and pressurized air, but beneath it all was something colder, resolve. "Is the cockpit open?" he asked, his voice even, controlled, the tone of a man not seeking aid, but purpose. The co-pilot, who had just stepped back into the cabin seconds before, blinked in disbelief. He had witnessed the entire scene and hesitated as though trying to process the sheer absurdity of what had just occurred. Garrett scoffed in the background, still clutching the now-empty teacup like a man proud of a job done. "You're not going anywhere," Garrett said, waving vaguely toward Kendrick. "He needs a doctor, not a dashboard." Kendrick turned his head slightly, ignoring the sting as the skin stretched over his blistering cheek. His eyes found the co-pilot's, and for a brief second, the tension in the cabin condensed into that single look. Kendrick didn't need to explain who he was or why it mattered. His poise did the speaking. A second flight attendant whispered into the intercom, alerting Captain Trenton Hale of an incident in the main cabin. The door to the cockpit cracked open as the captain's voice filtered through. "What happened out there?" "An altercation," the co-pilot responded, still stunned. "Passenger injured." Kendrick stepped forward, though each movement drew heat through his neck like dragging wires across fire. The younger flight attendant tried to block his path. "Sir, you really should sit." "No," Kendrick said, quiet but firm. "I'm not here for medical attention. I'm here because I'm the only one on board who understands the full manual override system if things go wrong. You're flying a prototype interface that I designed." From the cockpit, the captain's voice dropped into a lower register. "You're Dr. Kendrick Valen?" "I am," Kendrick replied. There was a pause, then a click, and the cockpit door opened wider. "Get in here." Garrett leaned back in his seat and barked a harsh laugh. "You really want the T-boy flying your jet now?" No one responded. Kendrick moved forward, each step slow but deliberate, his breathing measured, his left cheek bright red and swelling. As he passed Garrett, he didn't break stride, didn't offer a glance. There was no vengeance in his posture, only control. He carried the weight of pain, yes, but it did not bend him. In the cockpit, the captain stood from his chair, eyes narrowed. "We're hitting patchy weather, and the autopilot's been twitchy. We'll need help if that bug flares again. Kendrick nodded once. Then I'll sit co-pilot until we touch down. The door hissed shut behind them. Outside the cockpit, Garrett's smirk began to slip, the gravity of what he'd triggered starting to dawn. Around him, the passengers who had watched in stunned silence now shifted uncomfortably. A few looked down. One older businessman murmured to his seatmate, "He just burned the man flying the plane." The irony hung heavy. And in the cockpit, as Kendrick settled into the seat and began checking the system diagnostics through watery, burning eyes, he whispered more to himself than anyone else. Sometimes the storm you start reveals who can fly through it. The moment the boiling tea struck his face, Kendrick Vallon did not cry out. His jaw clenched tightly as the scalding liquid seared into the skin beneath his left eye and along his jawline. Red welts bloomed instantly, and a sheen of sweat burst across his brow. But he remained upright, one hand pressed against the blistering skin while the other gripped the armrest to steady himself. The flight attendant nearest him gasped and stumbled backward, her tray clattering to the floor. The co-pilot, having just emerged to check turbulence readouts, froze at the scene. "What happened?" he demanded wide-eyed. "He's fine," Garrett Voss said dismissively from 2 seats back, setting down the empty porcelain cup without remorse. "Just lost his composure." Kendrick turned slowly, his breath sharp through his nose, not from rage, but from pain managed with discipline. He didn't speak to Garrett. Instead, he raised his voice calmly. "I need to speak to the captain." Another attendant, Bren Hollis, appeared from a galley with a small red medical kit. "Sir, let me help you with that burn first." "Do both," Kendrick said, voice unwavering despite the fire on his skin. "Treat it while I walk." Escorted by the stunned co-pilot, and with burn gel hastily applied to his face, Kendrick moved toward the cockpit. The pain throbbed with every step, sharp and radiating, but it was secondary to something deeper, clarity. He wasn't just injured. He was provoked, underestimated, and now, unexpectedly, the only person who could prevent disaster. Inside the cockpit, Captain Trennan Hale turned from his displays as the door opened. His eyes immediately landed on Kendrick's injured face. "Sir, please stay seated. We have medics waiting on landing." Kendrick, standing just beyond the cockpit threshold, looked the captain in the eye. His voice, even imprecise, carried more weight than any rank. "Captain, permission to assist with flight control. We both know this model's interface was developed by my engineers. If anything happens, I'm your contingency." Trennan's hand hovered near the throttle, unsure. "You're injured. I'm functional. And this aircraft runs on Virion's AI suite. The recent update, 1.8.9b, has a bug in its redundancy loop. You've probably already seen flickers." The captain blinked. The autopilot jittered after the last software patch. Then you know what comes next if that loop collapses mid-turbulence. "Let me in." The co-pilot gave a hesitant nod behind him. Trennan finally moved aside, gesturing to the co-pilot's seat. Kendrick slid into place without hesitation, his bandaged cheek twitching as he lowered his weight gently. A low hum filled the cabin. Alerts from a navigation assist module indicated minor inconsistencies in atmospheric readings. Kendrick scanned the display and tapped several commands into the console. Back in the cabin, Garrett Voss chuckled darkly and leaned toward a fellow passenger. "You really want him flying your jet now?" he said loudly. "Looks like he can't even handle a teacup." No one laughed. Garrett didn't realize what the crew already knew. This was Kendrick Vallon, architect of the emergency override system, sitting silently behind the interface. Kendrick, despite the boiling liquid still fresh on his skin, was the only person on the plane who understood how to manually bypass the AI's corrupted logic threads if the flicker turned into a full-blown systems fault. Kendrick's fingers moved with calm precision. The instrument panel blinked as he rerouted auxiliary power, rebalanced the torque modules, and injected a stabilizer protocol into the inertial dampeners. A subtle lurch passed through the aircraft, then quieted. The storm outside still battered the wings, but the system inside had found its center again. "Override patch active," Kendrick announced. Manual redundancy stabilized. Captain Hale leaned forward, scanning the new data feed. The tremble in the vertical guidance lines had leveled. Wind vectors were resynced. The plane, moments ago flirting with a control issue, was now smooth, stable, and under complete control. Altitude pressure restored, the co-pilot confirmed. Flight is steady. A voice came over the cabin intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, the aircraft has been stabilized by a secondary manual assist. Please remain seated. No names were mentioned, but every attendant in the cabin, every passenger who had seen the incident, and even Garrett, who now sat uncomfortably rigid in his seat, knew exactly who was in control. Inside the cockpit, Kendrick exhaled slowly. His body leaned back for the first time since the scalding, his left cheek pulsing under the bandage. Sweat still trickled near the blisters, but his hands were steady. Captain Hale stared at him, no longer with concern, but with something else. Admiration. "You just saved us from a rough landing," he said, his voice low, almost humbled. Kendrick nodded once, his eyes still on the console. "I just wanted to arrive on time." And then, slowly turning his head toward the cockpit door, where Garrett's voice had last echoed, he added, "I'm still signing that contract." The autopilot blinked out with a sharp mechanical tone. Captain Trenton Hale muttered under his breath, "It's happening again." His fingers moved quickly across the controls, confirming what he already knew: systems were slipping. The same software glitch that had quietly haunted internal updates was back, and this time, the plane was caught mid-descent into a corridor of turbulent air. Kendrick Vallon didn't hesitate. Still standing near the cockpit, his face bandaged and pulsing with pain from the earlier scalding, he stepped forward and said firmly, "Let me in. I'll stabilize it manually through my emergency override patch." Trenton looked at him, weighing hesitation against reality. Then he nodded and pulled the co-pilot's chair back. "Strap in." Kendrick slid into the seat, his movements sharp but composed. The co-pilot, Bren Ravis, moved aside to allow him full access to the console. Kendrick's burned cheek twitched, the fresh layer of bandage already darkening with sweat and medicated salve, but his eyes remained locked on the instrument panel. His voice was low even. "Pressure thresholds need manual calibration. I'll start there." Outside the windshield, thick clouds swirled like smoke. Inside, the cabin lights dimmed for a moment, a system correction kicking in. A chime sounded in the passenger bay, and nervous murmurs echoed down the aisle. Kendrick's fingers flew across the controls, each tap exact. He opened a hidden sublayer in the avionics interface, one that only he and his team at Virion Systems knew how to access. His own design, his own code, his own contingency plan. "Fuel feed vectoring needs rebalancing," he said aloud, mostly for Trennan's confirmation. The captain nodded, sweat forming at his temple. Behind them, Garrett Voss leaned into the aisle with a smug expression, arms folded. "This is your backup plan?" Letting him guess his way through. But no one answered. Kendrick wasn't guessing. He was remembering. He diverted the auxiliary electrical load through 2 redundant backup systems, isolating the faulty node, causing the autopilot flicker. The cabin jolted slightly, then steadied. "Redirecting minor faults now," he said. The instrument panel flickered once more, then returned to full green. Inside the cabin, the nervous tension gave way to a cautious quiet. A flight attendant stepped to the front and picked up the intercom. "The aircraft has been stabilized by a secondary manual assist." His voice remained neutral, professional. No names were mentioned. But every passenger seated near the front of the cabin looked toward the cockpit with one thought. They knew. Garrett sank back into his seat, disbelief tightening his jaw. His eyes darted between the flight attendants and the cockpit, as if searching for someone else to blame. Kendrick exhaled through clenched teeth. The pain from his cheek was now pulsing down his jawline, but his grip didn't waver. His fingers eased away from the panel, as the system's metrics confirmed. Level altitude. Stabilized pressure. No emergency alerts. Trennan turned to him slowly, his eyes no longer skeptical. They were clear with understanding and respect. "You just saved us from a rough landing." Kendrick nodded once, eyes still scanning the readouts for lingering faults. "I just wanted to arrive on time." Then he leaned back slightly, and with his voice low, he added without looking behind him, "I'm still signing that contract." As the plane began its descent into Halden International, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a soft glow over the shaken yet silent passengers. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, less from the turbulence and more from the collective awareness of what had just occurred. Everyone had seen it. The flight attendant whispering into his comms, the rapid movements of the co-pilot, the sight of Dr. Kendrick Valen stepping forward, face burned, eyes locked, hands steady, overriding a system he had personally engineered. In the span of minutes, the man who had been insulted, scalded, and dismissed became the silent architect of their survival. In the cockpit, Captain Trenton kept his tone calm but purposeful. Final approach. Wind light from the west. Holding at 3,200 feet. Override holding stable. Beside him, Kendrick sat motionless, save for his fingers making minute adjustments. His face, partially wrapped in sterile gauze, radiated pain he didn't vocalize. When the nose gear touched the runway and the cabin gently tilted into braking position, a collective exhale swept through the aircraft. They had landed, not in chaos, not in panic, but with precision. Back in the main cabin, whispers began. Bryn Ravis, one of the younger flight engineers seated near the front, leaned toward his colleague, voice barely audible. "That's him, Kendrick Valen. He designed the override protocol that just saved us." His colleague blinked, still processing. "And that guy, Garrett, he threw the tea?" Bryn nodded grimly. Garrett Voss sat slouched, arms crossed, eyes darting as realization sank in. His earlier arrogance had curdled into something else, fear, maybe, or shame, possibly both. The moment the jet rolled to a complete stop at Gate 7, medical personnel boarded swiftly. A tall EMT with a scanner approached Kendrick with urgency. "Sir, we need to get you to emergency care, second-degree burns, maybe worse. Let's take you." Kendrick stood slowly, the pain evident in his stiff movement but completely absent from his voice. "Bandage it. I've got a contract to sign." Even the medics paused. There was something in the way he said it, calm, final, unshakable. One of them, a younger paramedic named Lauren, gently applied a new dressing, wincing as he saw the extent of the damage. "You sure, sir?" he asked. Kendrick gave a slight nod. "The pain will wait. History won't." With gauze covering the left side of his face, Kendrick stepped into the jet bridge, flanked by two Virion Systems staffers, Rain Coulson and Marek Venn, who had been waiting at the terminal for his arrival. Their eyes widened when they saw his condition, but Kendrick offered no explanation. Just a simple, "We're still on schedule," to which Rain nodded mutely. Garrett, several paces behind, tried to avoid drawing attention, ducking his head, adjusting his tie. But it was too late. Word had spread. Reporters, tipped off by a leak that Virion CEO would be arriving personally to finalize a high-stakes aerospace deal, had gathered near the tarmac. As Kendrick emerged from the plane, flashbulbs ignited the early evening gloom. Questions volleyed from every direction, but most were drowned in the chaos, until one voice cut clear. "Dr. Valen, what happened on board?" Kendrick stopped. The air around him seemed to hold its breath. He turned slowly, his eye making contact with the journalist's lens. His voice was steady, each syllable deliberate. "I landed a plane. Now, I'll land the future." Gasps rippled through the crowd, not from the drama, but from the understated magnitude of the moment. The man bearing physical burns had delivered a line that seared deeper than any scar. Garrett slipped into the back seat of a waiting car without a word, hoping to melt into anonymity. But the damage was already done. The story was already writing itself in real time, on phones, in headlines, across social media. The very man Garrett tried to humiliate had not only saved his life, but was walking forward in a legacy while Garrett disappeared into shame. Behind Kendrick, one reporter whispered to another, shaking his head in disbelief. The man he tried to humiliate just saved his life and is still making history. The elevator doors parted with a quiet chime, revealing the glass-paneled lobby of Bravern Forge's executive floor. Kendrick Valen stepped out alone. The moment he appeared, the hum of conversation along the corridors ceased like someone had cut power to the building. Eyes turned. Phones lowered. The bandage across Kendrick's left cheek was impossible to ignore, reddened, swollen beneath the gauze, a physical reminder of what had occurred mid-flight. But it wasn't just the injury that captured attention. It was how he walked. Back straight, hands steady, eyes forward. Not a limp, not a stagger. Just a man with purpose. Inside the boardroom, the tension was already coiled tight. Some executives whispered among themselves, speculating whether Kendrick would arrive at all. A few assumed he'd cancel, perhaps send lawyers, or at the very least, postpone. But there he was, 10 minutes early, just as he'd always been. The room fell into a hush as he stepped through the door. Vernon Hale, the lead contract officer and the one who had been preparing the financial projections, stood awkwardly. His voice cracked slightly. Dr. Vallon, given the, circumstances, should we consider rescheduling? Kendrick didn't miss a beat. No, he replied calmly. The numbers are ready. Let's talk performance. He sat at the end of the table without waiting to be offered a seat. His tablet clicked open, and a crisp projection screen came to life behind him. The presentation began instantly. No small talk, no preamble. Just facts, data, and execution timelines. As the slides shifted, so did the board's posture. One by one, the executives leaned forward. Kendrick's voice was measured, neither rushed nor performative, each point landing with clean precision. Behind the steady cadence, however, was a quiet storm of pain, of principle, and of resolve. Even with his face wrapped in medical gauze, Kendrick never wavered. Not once did he touch the bandage, flinch at the stares, or acknowledge the injury as a distraction. Every metric he presented was a reminder that he wasn't here for sympathy. He was here to finish what he started. Seated at the far corner of the polished mahogany table, Garrett Voss sat stiff, trying to appear disinterested, though a vein pulsed visibly at his temple. His foot tapped under the table. He had assumed Kendrick would crumble, or, at the very least, be too humiliated to continue the pitch. But each slide Kendrick presented sliced that illusion thinner. And then came the pivot. Kendrick paused, closed the final slide, and tapped his tablet again. The screen behind him shifted, not to a graph or a market projection, but to a cockpit interface recording. A ripple of murmurs coursed through the room. The audio feed crackled, then played clearly. You'll never be the face of aerospace. The words echoed with sharp clarity, Garrett's voice, unmistakable in tone and arrogance. Garrett jolted slightly in his seat. That's out of context. Kendrick didn't look at him. His eyes scanned the rest of the board. What you're hearing is from the aircraft's own cabin recorder, linked to the override interface my engineers developed. You'll also notice 2 seconds later, the override command string begins, executed by me. Mid-burn. The room froze. One executive lowered his pen slowly. Another looked at Garrett, then back at the screen. Kendrick clicked the playback off. Silence followed, heavier than before. I didn't come here to explain how I was burned, Kendrick continued, voice low but resolute. I came here to explain how your fleet stayed in the air. He stood slowly, allowing the full presence of his bandaged face to fill the board's view. Then, with deliberate motion, he reached into his leather briefcase and slid a secondary contract envelope across the table. It stopped in front of Vernon Hale. This includes supplemental safety protocols and AI failover analytics that my team has embedded directly into the turbine architecture. Full system redundancy. Seamless cross-jet integration. It's not a prototype. It's not theory. It's the system that kept your board member alive while he threw tea in my face. The statement struck like a hammer, not shouted, not embellished, just truth, anchored in experience and burned into skin. Garrett leaned forward, voice tight. You think this is about me? Kendrick finally turned his head, expression unreadable. It never was. Vernon opened the envelope. His eyes widened as he scanned the technical appendix. This exceeds the scope of the current agreement, he muttered, almost to himself. Kendrick nodded once, then adjusted the scope. The room stayed silent for several more seconds. Then, almost reluctantly, the chairman, Marek Doss, cleared his throat, and broke the stillness. "Mr. Voss," he said, voice level, "do you deny what we just heard?" Garrett opened his mouth, but no words came. His jaw tightened. His shoulders sank slightly. For the first time in his career, he had nothing to say. Kendrick didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. His gaze returned to Vernon Hale, who still held the document like it might combust. "It doesn't take a perfect face to build a flawless system," Kendrick said, voice even. Vernon exhaled, and in that moment, every doubt, every assumption, every whispered hesitation in the room shifted into awe. He just rewrote the pitch with one sentence. Boardroom politics ignited instantly. The moment the cockpit recording echoed Garrett Voss's condescending remark, "You'll never be the face of aerospace," a weight dropped over the entire boardroom. Every gaze shifted, some in stunned disbelief, others in quiet fury. The ambient hum of the air vents suddenly felt louder. The digital presentation screen went black as Kendrick Vallon, still bearing visible bandages across his left cheek, closed his laptop without ceremony. Chairman Marek Doss broke the silence with a gravelly voice. "Mr. Voss, do you deny this?" Garrett, seated near the far end of the long glass conference table, stiffened. His hands gripped the chair arms too tightly. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. His throat twitched, jaw clenched, yet no words formed. Beads of sweat dotted his temple. The very room he had once dominated now felt alien, charged against him. Kendrick didn't look triumphant. He didn't even appear angry. He looked focused, precisely, deliberately focused. Turning toward Garrett, his voice came low but sharp, like tempered steel. "You had a choice," he said. "You chose a cup of tea over a vessel of truth." The line cut deeper than a raised voice ever could. It was delivered with the steadiness of someone who didn't need revenge, just accountability. He reached into his slim leather briefcase, unlatched a silver clasp, and pulled out a single document in a black folder. Sliding it across the table without fanfare, he added, "If Virion doesn't get the contract, the AI override suite we deployed mid-flight will be removed from the next fleet, which means your safety ratings will plummet below competitive margins within 6 months." The document stopped just inches from Marek Doss's hands. Silence deepened again, this time heavier, more consequential. A few board members exchanged glances. Others didn't dare move. The air in the room felt thinner, as if waiting for someone to inhale the reality hanging in it. Marek took a slow breath and opened the folder. He flipped through the pages, scanning projections, contingency clauses, and internal safety benchmarks Kendrick's team had pulled directly from Bravern Forge's own quarterly reports. It was a chess move that had been prepared long before the flight, and now it was check. He looked up. "Effective immediately," he said, voice steady but subdued. "Virion Systems is our official turbine and override supplier." The tension shattered like glass. Kendrick nodded once, collected his briefcase, and stood. No dramatics. No extended stare. He had come not to plead, but to present, and he had delivered. He turned toward the door, but Marek called after him, "What about Voss?" Kendrick paused. He didn't turn back. His tone, flat but final, carried more weight than a raised voice ever could. "He'll make his own landing, I assume." Behind him, the murmurs began again, not of panic this time, but of movement, deliberation, votes. Garrett remained seated, frozen, pale, and quietly unraveling. The board would move quickly. They always did when liability loomed. Moments later, the decision was unanimous. Garrett Voss was suspended indefinitely. Sometimes the man you burn turns out to be fireproof. The attacker smirked, certain the pain would distract him, unaware that every decision, every calculation, and every ounce of restraint inside that cockpit was building toward a victory bigger than the burn. If you believe cruelty under entitlement always folds when discipline meets brilliance, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The lobby doors hissed shut behind him, but Kendrick Vallon didn't pause. His steps were even. The pain from the scalded skin beneath his bandage held behind a stoic gaze. The air outside Bravern Forge's corporate tower carried a muted chill, but inside, It was as if the atmosphere had thickened with unspoken reverence. He just walked out of a boardroom with a signed contract, one he'd earned not through force, but through poise and precision under pressure. His name was still echoing in whispered conversations down corridors and elevators. But Kendrick, unshaken by the spotlight or the silence, had already shifted his focus toward tomorrow. Then came the hesitation. Just near the edge of the sleek marble lobby, a group of young engineers stood in tight formation. They wore employee badges and navy blue visitor lanyards, members of Bravern Forge's internal diversity initiative. None of them had spoken during the earlier chaos. None had dared to. But now, their expressions wavered between admiration and uncertainty. One of them, no older than 25, took a tentative step forward. "Dr. Valen," he said, voice catching. "I'm Melrick. You've been my inspiration since college." Kendrick halted. The sound of his name, spoken without fear, without doubt, cut through the stillness like a clearing bell. He turned slowly. Elric stood with shoulders half raised, like someone who wasn't sure if he was allowed to speak louder. His eyes, however, burned with sincerity. For a long moment, Kendrick just looked at him. Not past him. At him. The faintest smile formed beneath the medical gauze. "Then keep flying higher than the ones who try to ground you," Kendrick replied. The words settled into the air like heat across tarmac, quiet but lasting. Elric blinked, visibly moved, and stepped back with a nod so firm it bordered on reverence. Outside the revolving doors, the world was already awake. News trucks waited along the far curb, their antennas rotating skyward. "Kamera flisches znept." Someone shouted his name. Kendrick said nothing. He simply moved forward, flanked by two Virion Systems aides who emerged from a nearby vehicle. The taller aide handed him a press release to glance at. He folded it without reading. He didn't need to. The story was already writing itself without spin. That night, headlines stormed the digital skyline. Injured CEO saves jet, secures historic contract. The Boiling Point deal, a moment that changed aerospace. Across forums, news feeds, and editorial columns, Kendrick Valen's image, bandaged but composed, began circulating like a silent emblem of earned dignity. Analysts dissected the audio footage leaked from the boardroom, replaying Garrett Voss's scathing remark and the surgical calm of Kendrick's response. Video overlays zoomed in on the moment Kendrick said, "It doesn't take a perfect face to build a flawless system." It became a soundbite that refused to fade. And yet, amid the swirl of public attention, Kendrick returned to Virion Systems not through the front entrance, but through the side service ramp. He preferred it that way. No cameras, no applause, just polished concrete, the faint hum of workstations, and the welcoming scent of solder, coffee, and vision. As he stepped onto the main R&D floor, the entire lab fell into silence. No claps, no words, just nods. Technicians looked up from circuits. Developers paused mid-keystroke. Engineers pulled off safety goggles and stood still. Kendrick met each gaze and nodded back one by one. Then, as he made his way toward his office, he passed the break room and stopped. A new sticker had been slapped onto the door. Glossy, crooked, bright white letters. T is temporary. Flight is forever. He stared at it. The silence behind him finally cracked into restrained laughter. Someone let out a soft chuckle. Another stifled a grin. His assistant, Corlin, stepped up behind him. "They did it last night," Corlin whispered, after they saw the clip. "No one's touched it since." Kendrick traced the edge of the sticker with a single finger, then exhaled slowly through his nose. "I suppose," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "They tried to pour heat on me." He turned back toward the hallway, steps measured, mind already on the next protocol rollout. But all it did was boil over into proof. 3 days after the flight, the knock on the door came just as Kendrick Valen was finishing a slow walk around his study. He winced slightly as he adjusted the cooling patch on his left cheek, an irregular web of blistered skin still healing beneath the sterile dressing. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned, not accidental. No meetings, no media, just a slow rhythm of recovery. When he opened the door, A uniformed courier handed him a sleek gray envelope embossed with a seal he immediately recognized. No logo, no flourish, just the clean insignia of the Federal Aviation Compliance Directorate. Kendrick took it without ceremony, closing the door behind him with a soft click. His fingertips trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the lingering effects of adrenaline withdrawal. He sat at his kitchen counter, light pouring through the wide windows. With a deliberate motion, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The message was short, precise. It commended him for his actions aboard Flight V7, specifically his intervention in manually overriding the turbulence stabilization system. Then came the offer, a formal invitation to collaborate with FACD engineers on a new national standard for in-flight manual override protocols across next-gen jet families. His eyes hovered over the words. Your conduct represents the highest standard of leadership and technical excellence in crisis. We request your input on drafting the next generation of airborne safety integration standards. He read the letter twice, then a third time, and only then did he lean back in his chair, exhaling, not with pride, but with quiet gravity. The moment was surreal. Burned, targeted, and doubted, he had somehow turned that moment of public humiliation into a foundation for national reform. Yet as the words sank in, he felt something else too. The tension of legacy pressing at the edge of his breath. This wasn't just about him anymore. The front door creaked again, this time followed by soft footsteps. One of the medical assistants, Darren, stepped into the room, holding a tray of supplies for Kendrick's afternoon dressing change. He was a young man, early 20s, lean frame, neatly braided hair, and sharp eyes that often lingered a second longer than necessary. But today, Darren moved slower, as if carrying something fragile. He set the tray down and reached into his coat pocket. This came through internal channels, he said, not quite meeting Kendrick's eyes. No sender. But I was told it was meant for you. He placed a plain, white envelope on the counter. No stamp. No handwriting. Just sealed with a strip of black tape. Kendrick picked it up carefully, opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was firm but unpolished, as if the writer hadn't meant to write something meaningful, until it became exactly that. You didn't just save the jet. You saved the reputation of every man who's ever been told to stay quiet and take the burn. There was no signature, no initials, but Kendrick knew. The wording, the framing. The emotion pressed between the lines. It was too precise, too personal. Somewhere in that aircraft, one of Garrett Voss's own interns had been watching, observing, learning. And when the moment came to choose between silence and truth, they chose the latter. He closed the envelope gently, as if folding a piece of living history. Darren had stepped back by then, fidgeting slightly. That note, whoever sent it, they saw everything, didn't they? He asked softly. Kendrick nodded once, then placed the letter in the top drawer of his desk. Sometimes the smallest witness carries the loudest truth, he replied. For the next hour, the house was filled with the low hum of distant traffic and the soft beeping from a health monitor temporarily stationed near the study entrance. Kendrick sat at his workstation, fingers hovering over the keyboard, unmoving. Then slowly, as if the words had been waiting for permission, he began typing. The first line read, Clause 17, Situational Ethics and In-Flight Authority Redistribution. He kept typing, outlining a set of provisions aimed at protecting pilots, engineers, and any crew member who takes control during emergencies, regardless of seniority, rank, or corporate pressure. He included language around ethical escalation, cabin authority chains, and protected disclosures when racial bias intersected with safety protocol. Midway through the draft, his assistant, Rollin, entered with coffee and glanced at the screen. "You're writing it already?" he asked. Kendrick didn't stop typing. It needs to exist before someone else pretends it does. Rollin placed the mug on the desk and grinned faintly. They'll call it the Valen Addendum one day. Kendrick just smiled without looking up. Let them. The signature already happened in fire. By the end of the month, Kendrick Valen stood just off stage, the warm weight of a spotlight seeping through the curtain onto his shoes. The Global Aerospace Integrity Forum was already underway, and murmurs from hundreds of attendees, engineers, CEOs, government regulators, buzzed like static behind the dark velvet. His name was about to be announced. A moderator adjusted the mic and spoke into the podium. Our next guest is a man who not only saved a plane mid-air, but redefined what leadership looks like under fire, literally. Please welcome Dr. Kendrick Vallon. He walked out to a standing ovation, the scar still healing across his left cheek, catching the overhead light. The applause wasn't something he'd sought, nor something he lingered in. He reached the microphone, adjusted it once with steady hands, and began without notes. I didn't come here to talk about what happened, he said plainly, voice calm but firm. I came to talk about what we do after something happens. I came to talk about how we respond, when we're respected, yes, but more importantly, how we respond when we're disrespected. The room quieted further. Kendrick's gaze scanned the audience, not for approval, but for focus. His suit was simple. No myths, no company pin, just the man and the message. You see, he continued, planes don't fly because people clap for them. They fly because of precision, discipline, design, integrity. He tapped the side of the podium once. And leadership, true leadership, doesn't emerge in applause. It shows itself when someone throws hot tea in your face and you still stabilize the jet. The words settled over the crowd like pressure equalizing in a cabin. Several executives glanced at one another. The story was known, but hearing it this plainly, this clinically stripped of drama, made it feel larger. Kendrick let the silence build before stepping forward again. I'm not here to recount scars, he said. Scars fade, so do excuses. But systems carry memory. They carry bias. They carry silence. Unless someone rewrites them mid-flight. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The stillness in the room was louder than any cheer. A man for the second row leaned forward, pen frozen mid-sentence. A junior engineer, sitting cross-legged in the back, had tears in his eyes and didn't know why. Kendrick's words were not just about flight. They were about every boardroom, every lab, every test site where restraint had been mistaken for weakness. Kendrick concluded the keynote not with a climax, but with a question. What will the black box say about us? Not when the system fails, but when someone steps in and saves it despite the burn. The applause that followed wasn't polite, it was resounding. A wave of standing bodies, united not by admiration, but by realization. Kendrick stepped off stage slowly, each step measured, unhurried. Backstage, he was approached by a man in a gray suit, older, white hair, gold Aerospace Review Council pin glinting on his lapel. He extended a sealed envelope. Dr. Vallon, the man said, his voice respectful, even deferential. The council would be honored if you'd consider co-leading the next decade's aerospace safety initiative. Your team's override systems and your example have redefined our benchmark. Kendrick accepted the envelope with a nod, but didn't open it. I'll review it with my team, he replied, and the man nodded, understanding that no further persuasion was needed or appropriate. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of handshakes, questions, camera flashes, and invitations. But Kendrick's mind was already miles away, somewhere quieter. He declined the after-event dinner. No interviews, no press briefings, just a car ride home under the soft hush of night. Back at his residence, Kendrick unlocked the door and stepped inside, the silence of the foyer greeting him like an old friend. The air smelled faintly of cedar and jet glue. From the study, a small voice called out. Uncle Kendrick, Jalen, his 10-year-old nephew, poked his head around the corner, a smudge of marker on his cheek. You said you'd help me finish the model tonight. Kendrick smiled, the day's weight slipping from his shoulders like a coat hung on a hook. I did say that. They moved to the work table in the study, where a half-built scale model of a dual-engine aircraft waited. Jalen handed him the glue, careful not to touch the scar. As Kendrick adjusted the left wing, he noticed a folded paper tucked into the corner of the blueprint mat. What's this? Jalen looked sheepish, then proud. I drew it today, at school. Kendrick unfolded the drawing. A child's crayon version of a jet soared through thick orange flames. In the cockpit was a small figure with a sharp black line across one cheek. On the wing, in jagged block letters, it read, "Uncle Kendrick always lands." Kendrick stared at it for a long moment, his fingers brushing the uneven paper surface. He folded it carefully and placed it beside his desk, between the ethics charter he was drafting and the sealed council proposal. "You don't steer through fire by fighting it," Kendrick said quietly, placing a final piece on the model jet's tail. "You fly above it." Garrett Voss released the statement mid-morning, less than 72 hours after the incident. It was brief, evasive, and clearly crafted by legal counsel. The event aboard the chartered flight involving Dr. Kendrick Vallon was regrettable. Due to sudden turbulence, a hot beverage was inadvertently spilled. "I deeply regret any discomfort caused." The release lacked apology, lacked ownership, lacked truth. It landed poorly. The press didn't bite. Within hours, reporters began posting side-by-side comparisons. Garrett's sanitized claim versus accounts from multiple passengers who had been seated close to the confrontation. The most damning came from Ezra Lane, a junior flight attendant, who submitted a sworn affidavit to Bravern Forge's internal review team. In it, Ezra detailed Garrett's verbal provocation prior to the incident and confirmed that there had been no turbulence at the moment the tea was thrown. "It was deliberate," Ezra wrote. He looked directly at Dr. Vallon, clenched the handle, and tossed the cup forward without hesitation. The affidavit was soon followed by two more, one from the co-pilot who had escorted Kendrick to the cockpit, and another from a systems engineer returning from a conference. Both corroborated the same timeline, the same calm demeanor from Kendrick, and the same targeted hostility from Garrett. Bravern Forge convened an emergency ethics committee hearing. The room was dimly lit, blinds half drawn against the harsh morning light. A panel of 6 male executives, neutral faces with sharpened instincts, reviewed the submitted materials. Garrett was summoned, but declined to appear in person, opting for a video call instead. His screen flickered on, revealing him in a well-lit office, attempting a composed expression. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said, his tone measured. "I have decades of service at Bravern. This doesn't reflect my character." The chairman of the ethics committee, Colin Drax, leaned forward slightly. "That's precisely what we're investigating, whether it reflects a pattern." Colin then displayed a timeline on the screen behind him. Instances of internal complaints filed over the past 5 years. Subtle phrases, recurring patterns, dismissive tone, condescending toward junior staff, unwilling to mentor minority engineers. Most have been closed without resolution. But now, in the wake of the tea incident, the dots connected like an overdue constellation. Silence followed as the boardroom filled with unspoken judgment. The vote was held quietly, without public record. Garrett's board membership was terminated effective immediately. A secondary clause removed his travel privileges across Bravern Forge's partner airline network, a symbolic yet pointed gesture. He would no longer have access to the very cabins he once claimed were above men like Kendrick. 2 days later, a confidential internal memo was leaked. Addressed to Garrett, it read only, "Mr. Voss, we wish you a safe and silent journey." The news broke across financial and aviation media alike. While the headlines focused on the ethics ruling, the subtext was unmistakable. Garrett Voss had become a cautionary tale. Not for the tea, for the arrogance. For underestimating a man who chose control over chaos. Kendrick, recovering quietly at home, received the update via his assistant, Murrin. The younger man entered Kendrick's study holding a tablet. "It's done," he said. "Voss is out, grounded permanently." Kendrick didn't look up from a schematic he was sketching. He simply asked, "Did they release a statement?" "Only the memo." "And did they mean it?" Murrin hesitated. "I think they meant every word." Kendrick finally looked up, expression unreadable. The healing scar on his cheek caught the warm afternoon light. "No press comments," he said softly. "Let the silence do the talking." Still, word spread internally. Virion's staff began calling it poetic justice. In break rooms, engineers repeated the phrase that had surfaced online, "The man who mocked the team now flies coach," if they even let him board. But Kendrick kept his distance from the gossip. He hadn't asked for Voss's downfall. He'd simply walked through fire and chosen not to throw it back. Later that evening, Kendrick took a solitary walk along the tarmac behind Virion's test facility. The engines of a prototype whirred faintly in the hangar nearby. As he looked out toward the open runway, a light breeze stirred the edge of his coat. His thoughts weren't on revenge. They were on velocity, vision, legacy. When a junior staffer passing by hesitantly asked what he thought about Garrett's final removal, Kendrick paused, then answered without turning around. He was given altitude, but chose turbulence. The moment Captain Trenton Hale stepped onto the stage, the auditorium fell into respectful silence. His uniform, crisp and decorated, shimmered faintly under the soft blue lights of the Skyframe scholarship ceremony. A large screen behind him displayed looping footage of Virion Systems' prototype turbines powering the next generation of sustainable jets. But it wasn't the technology that stole the room's attention. It was Trenton's voice, shaky but honest. "I judged him by reputation," he began, eyes scanning the audience of students, engineers, journalists, and aerospace veterans. "But I trusted him by instinct. That trust saved all of us." His voice cracked at the end. He looked down briefly, collecting himself. The room didn't move. Kendrick Vallon sat just off stage, his posture upright, his expression unreadable. A faint scar still lined the edge of his left cheek, a reminder of fire and composure under pressure. But here, tonight, he was not the burn man. He was the builder, the founder, the force behind Skyframe, a scholarship initiative aimed at uplifting underrepresented students who had long been left out of aerospace innovation conversations. The program had gone from concept to launch in under 3 weeks. Now, the first cohort of recipients sat in the front rows, all male, all wide-eyed, each with a name tag and a dream in their pocket. The applause came slowly at first, then rose in waves after Trenton stepped down. The spotlight shifted. Kendrick walked forward, each step measured, controlled, dignified. He adjusted the single button on his tailored jacket and looked out at the sea of young faces. Then he spoke, not from prepared notes, but directly, as if aiming every word straight into the minds before him. "There will be people who ask you to earn the sky with silence," Kendrick said, voice calm but firm. But silence never stabilized a jet midair. Vision did. Design did. Precision did. He let that sink in. A few of the older engineers in the back exchanged glances. They knew what he meant. He continued, "Don't wait for fire to show you what you're made of. Build systems that fly through it before the flame even touches you." The screens behind him shifted to a slow zoom on a cockpit diagram, the same interface Kendrick had overridden with blistered fingers. Dramatic irony lingered like an unspoken guest. Most in the room knew the story by now. What they didn't know, what Kendrick had never shared publicly, was the moment in the cockpit when he'd almost said no, when the burn had pulsed so hard behind his eye that his vision doubled. And still he flew. In the third row sat Elric, the young Bravern engineer Kendrick had once encouraged in the lobby. Tonight, he clutched a full-time offer letter in one hand, his other hand trembling slightly as he wrote notes. He had grown up studying men like Marek Doss and Garrett Voss, thinking power was something cold, unreachable, and inherited. Now he realized power could bleed, but still walk forward, that it could burn and still take the stage. Kendrick shifted his gaze toward him mid-sentence. Elric straightened instinctively. "You don't need scars to prove you belong in this room," Kendrick said, pausing only long enough for the weight to settle. "But if you have them, let them be shaped by what you built after, not what broke you before." The lights dimmed slightly, and a series of names began scrolling across the backdrop, the inaugural Skyframe recipients. Applause rippled once more. Kendrick closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them with fresh clarity. "Captain Hale didn't know me," he continued. "But in the sky, instinct overruled assumption. And that single act of trust one moment meant we all made it down in one piece." There was no need to retell the full incident. The irony of naming the first scholarship after Trenton Hale had already caused private boardroom debate. Kendrick had insisted, not out of sentiment but principle, Trust had become the unseen landing gear of the entire operation. He ended the keynote without crescendo, but with a tone that demanded memory. The skies don't care what color you are, but they'll reflect everything you carry into them. The moment was still, yet loaded, like the pause before a storm. Kendrick Valen stood on the tarmac beside the gleaming prototype of Bravern Forge's latest aerospace marvel, its engine silent but full of potential. The morning sun bounced off the polished metal, reflecting a future only a few dared to shape. Just behind the jet, painted in sweeping strokes across the hangar wall, was a mural, a stylized aircraft cutting through flames, with four bold words beneath it: "Proof doesn't always yell." It had been unveiled only hours ago, but already it felt like it had always belonged there. Jalen, now 10, stood at Kendrick's side, fidgeting with the brim of a small flight cap that was slightly too big for his head. He glanced up at his uncle's face, at the faint scar that curved like a whispered story across his left cheek. The boy's voice broke the silence, curious and thoughtful. "Uncle Kendrick," he asked, his voice soft but steady, "why didn't you hit him back that day?" Kendrick turned, his eyes slowly lowering to meet the boy's. For a moment, the question hovered like a challenge, one that echoed louder than the engines ever would. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he knelt, eye to eye with the boy, grounding the moment not with power, but with presence. "Because I was flying something bigger than a fist," Kendrick said quietly. "I was flying the future." Jalen blinked. "The future?" Kendrick nodded, one hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. "Yes. When someone tries to burn you down, they want you to fight back in their language. They expect fury, not focus. But if you rise above it, if you respond with skill, not rage, you fly higher than they ever planned to let you." The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of jet fuel and ambition. Kendrick stood, his body still carrying the stiffness of healing, but with none of the bitterness of wounds left untreated. Behind him, technicians continued prepping the jet for its formal unveiling. One of the younger engineers, Tomas Varin, passed by and nodded respectfully. Kendrick returned it with a faint tilt of his chin. He could still remember the boiling heat against his face, the gasp of the cabin, the heavy silence of judgment that followed. But that moment, violent and humiliating as it was, had become something else entirely. Not a scar, but a mark. Not of weakness, but of endurance. As he walked forward, Jalen followed, taking 3 quick steps to keep up. The pair passed the mural again, and Kendrick paused beneath it. He didn't need to say a word. The image said everything. From behind, a voice called out. It was Bryn Ravis, the same junior engineer from that flight. "Dr. Valen," he said, holding a tablet, "we're ready for the systems check when you are." Kendrick nodded once, his voice even. "Let's do it." They entered the hangar. Light filtered through the skylights in long golden beams, illuminating the prototype like a sculpture carved from motion and vision. As Kendrick stepped toward the testing platform, Jalen lingered at the edge of the hangar, eyes still on the mural. Outside, reporters began to gather behind barricades. Cameras focused, microphones clipped to collars. But inside, Kendrick had already tuned them out. He had no interest in repeating the story everyone thought they understood. He wasn't here to relive pain. He was here to repurpose it. He reviewed the diagnostics silently while Ravis ran him through the checklist. Turbine temperatures, fuel redundancy matrices, override interface toggles, each confirmed, each signed off with a precision that had made Virion systems synonymous with control under pressure. At the far end of the hangar, one of the original test pilots approached. "The team says this new system is fire-resistant even at peak turbulence," he said. Kendrick gave a quiet smile. "It has to be. So is the man who made it." With the test complete, Kendrick stepped back as the prototype's engines roared briefly to life for a systems demo. The sound filled the hangar, deep, steady, confident. Outside, the press reacted to the noise. Questions would come. They always did. But Kendrick was done answering the old ones. Jalen walked back over, lifting the flight cap off his head and looking up again. Will they ever say sorry? Kendrick looked out through the hangar doors, at the sky beginning to warm with the noon sun. They don't have to, he said calmly. We already landed without them. Jalen didn't fully understand. Not yet, but he would. One day, when his own storm arrived, he'd remember how silence had been louder than vengeance, and how legacy had flown higher than noise. Kendrick turned away from the sunlight, toward the future still being built behind him. The past hadn't disappeared, but had been reframed, redrawn, and reclaimed. And with that, he walked into the hangar, leaving behind the past not forgotten, but reshaped. Legacy doesn't scream, it lands. Minutes later, the jet touched down smoother than ever. The board applauded, and the contract was signed, leaving the attacker stunned as the CEO walked past him with quiet, undeniable power. If you believe real authority achieves success even through fire, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, arrogance, and the power of composure and skill in the face of disrespect. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and rising above prejudice with integrity.